Hey entrepreneurs and website owners, if you're ready to take your online presence to the next level, you need a reliable web host, and that's where HostGator comes in. HostGator is your one-stop solution for easy, affordable, and powerful web hosting. Whether you're launching a blog, an online store, or anything in between, HostGator's got you covered. Don't miss out on creating the website you've always wanted. Visit krmpods.com/HostGator today and let your online journey begin.
You're listening to Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem, your bi-weekly dose of true crime history in a small rural community of Wisconsin.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem. I'm Eric.
I'm Gavin.
And Gavin, we are back in our... God, when's the last time we did a podcast in the evening? It's kind of creepy.
Oh, I don't remember.
It's been
no
years.
Yeah, we're sitting here in the dark.
Yeah. So what are we talking about today?
Today we're going to have a nice story of violence in the wonderful town of Chilton.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Not a frequently visited place, I don't think, is Chilton.
No, we don't have too many Chilton stories, but today we do. And in fact, today's story was submitted by a listener named Toby.
Oh, very cool.
So
did Toby write the script? Or
no, Toby did not write. No. Just pointed
we gotta ask.
Pointed me in the right direction. I will be up front and let people know that the Chilton newspaper, as far as I know, is not online anywhere. And as far as I know, there's not an index to it. So I did not personally go and look up the Chilton newspapers. I've done it in the past. I mean, a long time ago. I've done it in the past. It can be done, but I didn't do that. But luckily...
So I take it where most of our information is coming from somebody else's newspaper?
Well, I couldn't find it in other newspapers either, which is weird. But somebody was very nice, and they typed up the important articles and posted them on the Find a Grave website. So
interesting.
So yes, I suspect there's probably more out there. But the thing is, if I can't search for the names, there's only so much I can do about that.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, the person we're going to be concerned with today is a man named Ephraim Granger. It's not a bad name. He's born October 1822. To give you an idea, this is a while back.
Yeah, we also have not gone back this far in a while, I think, either.
Yes. He's from western New York State, vaguely in the area of Buffalo or Rochester. I mean, not really at all, but just to give people an idea of what I'm saying, like western New York, that's what I mean. You can look up New York and see everything that's west. There's nothing there. Despite being New York, there's a lot of empty area. He got married to a woman named Margaret Wright in September 1847 in New York. They had a handful of children. They lived first in New York before moving to Chilton in the 1850s. Chilton was a rural community made up largely of German immigrants. A decade before they arrived, it had actually been settled by a former slave named Moses Stanton, but it appears that Stanton sold off his land by 1852. That is a story I would love to know more about, but there's surprisingly little out there.
Really?
Yeah.
So you did dig into that to see if you could find out more?
Yeah, I was like, it's not relevant to today's story, but I'm like, this former slave starting Chilton, that sounds like a great story.
No, that does sound like an amazing story.
But it doesn't seem like there's a lot out there. So, future research project. What the Granger family did in the 1860s and 1870s beyond farming, I don't know. Again, as I said, I don't have a way to search the newspapers. Chilton had a newspaper as far back as 1857, which is really impressive.
Mm-hmm.
The newspaper I'm most familiar with is the Kaukauna newspaper, and they didn't come around until 1880. So Chilton kicked their butts. A photo on Find a Grave suggests that Ephraim served in the Civil War, specifically in Company H of the 48th Wisconsin Infantry from February through September 1865. He would have been in his 40s at the time. He joined very late, and he didn't really see any notable battles. The group that he was with lost only 16 men, and all of those were to disease. There was not from battle wounds. So I'm guessing by 1865, which, if you don't know, like that's the final year of the Civil War. I'm guessing at that point they're pretty desperate if they're calling up 40-year-old guys. But by that point, once he was trained and shipped out, it was kind of wrapping up. In July 1878, Margaret Granger, his wife, attended a camp meeting held on Doty Island. Originally, camp meetings were held in the frontier areas where people without regular preachers would travel on occasion from a large region to a place where they could go camp, pray, sing hymns, listen to preachers, and so on. Camp meetings were kind of a place you went for community, and you could sing, listen to music. Sometimes there's dancing. It was just a place like if you didn't have a regular church you attended, you would go to the camp meeting when they came through town.
Interesting.
Yes. This was kind of like a big thing as Christianity was swelling back up in the early 1800s. By this time, 1870s, it's not really a big thing anymore, but apparently still happened. Margaret went there and became very enthusiastic about religion. And when she came home, she was said to possess a disordered mind bordering on insanity. Still that same month, a few days previous to her examination for commitment at Oshkosh Asylum, she jumped through a window. She was conveyed to Oshkosh, where she remained some time, improving considerably. Lack of room at the asylum resulted in her returning to her home in Chilton, where she was cared for by family. At times, she would be much worse, and during these bad spells, she would frequently threaten to take her own life and had to be kept under close watch.
So hold on now. There's no indication of her anything being wrong with her prior to this, and then she goes to this camp, gets really religious, and now she suddenly needs to be locked up in the asylum.
That is the way the story is written. I'm not saying that's what happened, but that's the way it's written. Yes.
Okay.
So again, this is late 1870s. So she's sticking in there, having good days, bad days. Then for a few weeks in March 1885, a few years later, she had another of those severe attacks. She was wild and unmanageable and continually threatened to take her own life. On one occasion, she tried to accomplish this by throwing herself into a pond on the farm. She was restrained by her husband, who took the precaution of, when he brought her back to the house, tying her hands so she couldn't go back out again. Then early on the morning of April 29th, 1885, while her family was asleep, Margaret took her own life by holding her head in a barrel of rainwater. The report of the suicide was soon confirmed by neighbors visiting the scene. The coroner was called by a neighboring farmer, and she was pronounced dead by suicide and buried in the local cemetery.
Wow. So now that's another crazy little tidbit. She stuck her head in a thing of rainwater. That seems like it would be really, really hard to pull off.
Right. Right. And I'm glad you said that, because keep this in mind. Keep this in mind going forward for the story.
Okay.
The official cause of death is she committed suicide by holding her head underwater in a barrel.
Yeah.
Which, yes, I mean, I've not tried it. But I assume it's not easy.
Yeah, I'm not thinking that it's going to be really hard not to pull your head out at some point.
Yes. So there is that. A year after Margaret's death, Ephraim, who's now 64 years old, marries 32-year-old Mary Jane Raymond. They have two more children, Hattie and Ruby. Because of this age gap, some of the children from his first marriage are actually older than his second wife, meaning that his eldest grandchildren were older than his youngest children.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he married a 32-year-old. How old is he at this point?
64.
Holy cow.
Yeah. I mean, they're both consenting adults, but that's a pretty good gap.
That's a healthy gap.
Yeah. All right. Although Ephraim is barely referred to in his first wife's obituary, he hardly comes up at all. They focus on this whole backstory of her going crazy. Apparently, he came to have a bad reputation by the late 1880s, early 1890s. The newspaper said he was a cross, ill-natured man for years. He often quarreled with his wife, his second wife, which culminated in his making a brutal assault upon her on July 30th, 1896. And this is going to be a long ramble here for a second.
Okay.
So bear with me. He attacked her with a hammer, inflicting the following injuries: a scalp wound 2 1/2 inches in length over the vortex of the skull, and 2 scalp wounds, each 1 1/2 inches in length, situated a little to the right of the center and about 1 inch posterior of the forehead. Also a scalp wound on the back of the right ear. The ear was bruised and swollen, and it was dark purple. There was a wound over the right malar bone, which is where your cheek meets the eye socket, which was contused and incised. The right eye was completely closed from a severe contused wound of the same. The lower jaw was contused and swollen, and in front of the right ear was a deep depression, the result of a contused wound.
Wow.
Her right forearm was wounded near the wrist joint, and her arm was nearly broken. The little finger of her right hand was badly smashed, in addition to her head being pummeled. So some sort of technical language in there, but basically he has a hammer, and he apparently beats her repeatedly in the head and the arm. I'm guessing the arm is her trying to stop him from hitting her in the head. So what caused this argument, I don't know. This is not the appropriate response to that.
You think?
Yeah. It was pretty obvious to everybody that he had intended to kill his wife. I mean, if that wasn't his intent, he went way over the top.
Yeah.
The neighbors and the local authorities said that he probably would have succeeded, except that there was a timely arrival of their farmhand, a man named Gideon Nelson, who was attracted to the house by the cries that he heard from their daughter. He came in to see why she was crying and found her mother being beaten, and so he broke up the fight. Weak and bleeding, she was moved to a neighbor's house and cared for. Among other things, she had a severe concussion. Yeah, I already listed all the other things.
But she actually survives this, huh?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Ephraim Granger went to his barn, and he got some rope with the intention of hanging himself. But then he decided not to. He put the rope back and went about his day working on the farm as usual. That evening, his hired men, John Brown and Gideon Nelson, received their orders for the next day, and they returned to their homes. That would be the last time they saw Granger alive. The night passed, and no unusual noise was heard in the neighborhood. In the morning, a neighbor's son noticed that Granger's cows had not been milked and immediately notified his father. I have no idea how you can tell if a cow's been milked. So
I wasn't going to ask that question, but I was really curious.
Yeah. I don't know how you can walk by cows and be like, these cows have clearly not been milked.
Yeah.
And maybe there's some farmer out there who's like, well, obviously, but I don't know.
We'll have to ask our farmer friend tomorrow.
Yeah. All right. So the neighbor came by to see why the cows hadn't been milked. As he entered the yard, the presence of a pile of feathers mixed with tar attracted his attention. He went to the door, and it wasn't locked, so he pushed it open and discovered in a southeast room a disordered bed stained with tar and feathers, and upon turning around, he saw the lifeless form of Ephraim Granger in the bedroom just opposite of that. Granger was in a kneeling position, his rigid body leaning back on a bed, and his appearance was ghastly. His face and body were smeared with tar and feathers. With the exception of the 2 bedrooms, everything in the house seemed to be in order. On a table in the room separating the two bedrooms was a cup containing Paris green, and alongside the cup lay a large knife and a teaspoon. The appearance indicated that Granger committed suicide that morning, and to cover up his crime of suicide, he tarred and feathered himself so that the public would believe that he was murdered in his home. I will answer your question now. Paris green was largely something that was used as a paint. It was green-colored paint, as you can guess.
Okay.
But one of its primary ingredients was arsenic, so it was sometimes used as a poison as well. So if we are to believe this story, what he has done is he covered himself in tar and feathers and then drank poison. And he didn't just want to drink the poison. He wanted to make it look like somebody broke in and tarred and feathered him.
All right.
That's officially the story. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody actually had broken in and tarred and feathered him, because the neighbors were pretty pissed with him at this moment. Also, tarred and feathered. I mean, that is the first and probably last time that will ever come up on this podcast.
Yes. I mean, what possesses you? I wanted to make it look like somebody killed me, so I should tar and feather myself. Yeah. It just doesn't seem like.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. How will I convince people I was killed? Oh, I'll cover myself in chicken feathers. Yeah, okay. All right, man. Sure.
Maybe it was a thing back then.
Yeah, in his obituary, they noted that Granger was a man of violent temper, and it took very little to anger him. It is said that he used to abuse and maltreat his first wife at the slightest provocation, and from the result of such treatment, her mind became unbalanced. After several years, her lifeless body was one day found in a rain barrel near the Granger home. The stories whispered about the neighborhood were to the effect that the poor demented woman came to her death by other than her own hands. Now, so this is the thing here. So when she dies, they write in the obituary that she had gone crazy from attending religious meetings and then drowned herself in a rain barrel. Now that he's dead, they changed their story, and they're like, oh yeah, this guy was a total dick. He drove her mad, and he's probably the one that drowned her. Like, why didn't they say that the first time?
Yeah, I have no idea, but it seems very reasonable that he's probably responsible, right?
Today, that seems to be the popular opinion. We, of course, cannot know. There's no, I mean, this is, 150 years ago. There's no way to know. But he seems a more likely suspect to me than holding your head underwater.
Yes, because I'm still trying to wrap my head around how you would even do that and succeed.
Regarding his second wife, the newspaper said, he had abused and beaten her at various times. A few years ago, he assaulted her in an inhumane manner. She came to Chilton, the town hall in Chilton. They're already in Chilton. Mm-hmm. And made a complaint to authorities. A warrant was sworn out. Granger was arrested, convicted, and fined. Mrs. Granger began proceeding for a divorce, but dropped the matter at the request of Granger, who pleaded for another chance and promised to lead a better life. The necessary papers for the arrest of Granger for assaulting his wife were drawn up by the district attorney and were to be served by the sheriff on Friday. This is now this brutal beating with the hammer.
Okay.
But before the papers were placed in the sheriff's hands, the people in Chilton were notified that they didn't have anybody to give those papers to because he was tarred and feathered. His wife recovered from her injuries, ultimately passed away in February 1925, so 30 years later, in Los Angeles, of all places. She moved out west to Los Angeles. But, final sad footnote, their daughter, Hattie, died of suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning in 1937.
Wow. Not a very good luck for the family, huh?
No. But like I say, this, thanks to the very colorful language of the obituary writers, this story is a great story on its own. I think it could be an even better story if I knew how to find things in the Chilton newspaper, because him being arrested for assaulting his wife and her considering divorce, that would be in the Chilton papers. Absolutely would be in the, and without a date, there's no way to find it.
I'm just curious, did they give a reason why they believe that he committed suicide because of the poison? Is that
why they think it was suicide?
Yeah, like why? Yeah. Because I mean, he was tarred and feathered. I mean, and obviously people are going to be, like you said, pissed at him. So
yeah, I mean, I don't know why he committed suicide. I don't know if he was ashamed of himself or if he just didn't want to face going to court again. I mean, I don't know what's in his mind, but he clearly again, the way the newspapers are written, you always got to question the accuracy. Like, did he go out to the barn, put out a rope, and then take it back down? Or was that the editor just having fun? I don't know. Like, there's a lot of times the newspapers back in the day would kind of like make colorful stories. Like, the story itself would be true, but they'd add little details.
Yeah.
And so I can't say that happened. But the tarred and feathered part definitely happened. So... yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what his motivation was, but clearly he thought at that point he had nothing left to do. Right?
Yeah, he probably figured he was going away for a really long time. I mean, so, and I would assume the first wife, they just never bothered to look at it any more than a suicide just because of her mental state.
Well, see, that's the thing, because the way it was written was they actually call it a coroner's inquest. And I will remind listeners what a coroner's inquest is, because I don't know the last time we've mentioned that. But a coroner's inquest used to be this, well, I suppose they can still do it, but it used to be more common. A thing they would do where they would basically pick like 6 people from the community to serve on kind of like a jury of sorts. They would have a couple people who were witnesses testify to them. They would usually look at the body, and then that group would decide what the cause of death was, because the coroner traditionally didn't really have to have medical training. So, now today you call in the coroner, and hopefully the coroner is actually a doctor and can determine a real cause of death. But that wasn't always the case. So it was kind of like, what do we all agree is the most likely outcome? And they did. That was what they did. They met and they decided they thought it was suicide. So I don't know who the witnesses were, but apparently they made a pretty convincing case that she had been crazy for some time. And
wow, that's sad. Well, and man, how many years did he get away with murder? Probably. I mean, I guess we don't know, but
it sounds like it. I mean, that's a good 10 years, I think. So yeah, he was out there for a while.
Craziness.
Yeah, but yeah, this is one. Like many, we say this a lot in the podcast, or at least I say this a lot in the podcast. Love to have more of this story. And this is another one of those, because I think there's probably some really juicy pieces out there. And
once again, just another really, really good story that never gets told.
It's a great story. It's helped a lot by, again, the colorful writer at the newspaper. But even without that, like, I loved it. So full disclosure, I'm gonna give away a secret to the listeners. Okay, I'll give a secret to you as well. So I'm reading like the few newspaper coverages that were posted online. So again, thank you to the person who posted them online. And like, it's a long story about the first wife, and that it goes on. Like, a lot of what I said here today is taken from that and just sort of modified a little bit. Like, they said, she became overly enthusiastic when she went to the camp meeting, da-da-da-da-da. And I read that, and I'm like, what the hell's a camp meeting? so I just want to be very clear, like, to the listeners, like, like 2 weeks ago, I didn't know what that was. Like, once I read about it, I'm like, oh, okay, and then I understood, but I had never heard it referred to as that.
So you knew that there was like, because based on how you described it, it almost sounds like a traveling church.
Yes.
And you knew something like that existed back in the day. You just never heard of it referred to as a camp meeting.
Yeah, that was a real. So this is way beside the point. But people may be surprised to know that, like, the late 1700s, early 1800s, a lot of Americans weren't really very religious.
Okay.
Like that wasn't really a thing. I think it's pretty well known that most of the founding fathers weren't particularly religious, but like in general, a lot of people just weren't at all. And so in the early 1800s, that was a thing. Like they had what they called revivals, and they would go out there and they were trying to revive people's Christian faith.
Okay.
So yeah, you'd have these preachers who would travel around in wagons, and they'd preach, and they'd tell these exciting stories and get people all excited again, and be like, yeah, church isn't just that boring thing you do on Sunday. Like we really, we're out here celebrating.
Kind of almost sounds like we might be due for one of these now, huh?
Well, it happens from time to time.
Does it really?
Yeah. I mean, it would be different now because we're not talking like horse and buggy days anymore. But you can even look at like, even in the 1900s, in the last 100 years, people can look this up. They can verify this. Like, church attendance had dropped, like in the 30s and 40s, and then in the 50s, things came back around the other direction again.
Mm-hmm.
And it was weird because, like, so this is way we're way off this episode, but like in the 50s is like when they added under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, and they added in God we trust to the money. And like a lot of that was in response to the rise of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was seen as this terrible evil, and they were an atheist thing because they had basically outlawed religion there.
Mm-hmm.
And so our response to that is like, well, if they're our enemy, we're going to go the other way and be as religious as we can. We're going to put God on everything. So
that's so funny.
So, like, we grew up in a time where, like, this was normal. But prior to the 50s, you didn't have the word God slapped on everything. That's actually a relatively recent thing.
And which is so weird because I would think that would have happened way back in the day.
Right.
Because I just feel like the further back you go, the more religious people were. But obviously that is not the case.
Yeah, not necessarily, no.
But I mean, I assume when it's a wave, right? So like,
yeah, it's a wave.
So it'll go down and then it shoots back up.
Because yeah, like I said, like the founding fathers weren't particularly religious, but then people who know like the basics of American history are going to be like, well, what about the Pilgrims, and what about Yes, there were definitely groups of religious adherents, very excited religious groups that came over and founded communities. Absolutely. But as a country as a whole, it definitely had its highs and lows.
So interesting. I wonder when we're going back up, because I feel like we're in a decline right now. So does that mean that at some point in time something's going to happen and then they're going to pick it back up and it's going to become big again?
Could be.
So
yeah, you could be right. I mean, even in our lifetime, I mean, maybe we're just not the right people, but I feel like the whole like evangelist thing has dropped off a lot from what it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
I could name a bunch of evangelists from the 80s. I can't name really any now.
That's interesting. So, all right, well, I guess that'll wrap this episode up, huh?
Yeah.
Hopefully,
that went way up. Anybody who listens this far is like, what the hell?
And we want to thank our listener for submitting that story, and once again to all our other listeners out there.
Yeah, that's a thank you to. I don't want to use Toby's last name because I don't know if they want to be recognized or not, but they know who they are.
Well, we thank Toby, and just another example to our listeners that submit stories, man. We're interested in them, and this is probably the only podcast on the planet that they'll actually do your story on.
That may be.
But
this one, yeah, I'm really glad this one. I mean, I'm glad any time a story gets brought to my attention, but this one, you've heard the expression "tarred and feathered."
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But have you ever actually known a case?
No. I just thought it was an expression. Okay.
I think it usually is. But yeah, this was wow.
So, all right. With that, we'll wrap this episode up. We want to thank everybody for their continued support of this podcast. If you do have a story, you can shoot that over to us at MilwaukeeMafia@gmail.com. And we will see everybody back in 2 weeks with another episode. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem. Join us in 2 weeks for another exciting episode of Murder and Mayhem.